All right. So, welcome everyone to our April Roundtable. And I titled it For Such a Time as This because I wanted to have as much of a conversation as we could that references some of the things that I think for many of us are probably swirling around in our heads in general, and then specifically relate that to some of the work, the theology work and historical work that Westar is known for. And to that end, we have two of our scholars with us tonight, but let me first go ahead and introduce just a little bit about Westar for anyone that might be unfamiliar. First of all, I guess I should say I am Alexis, and I usually facilitate these conversations. And so thanks everybody for joining us. And Westar, for anyone that doesn't know, is the way I kind of describe it is we like to think of ourselves as bridging the gap between the scholarship of religion and culture. And more how that's playing out, especially nowadays, is through this kind of virtual interaction. Although certainly over Westar's 35 plus year history, there's been a whole host of ways that they have done that. The Jesus Seminar was probably one of the best known ways, and subsequent seminars and books and publications. We have magazines and trade publications, and our website is very alive with scholars' thoughts on the blog and all sorts of things. So there's a variety of ways that we do that, but certainly these calls and these Q&As are a big piece of that. So I'll introduce our scholars and then have them share a little bit about their work and around the topics tonight. And then we will have a chance to go into Q&A with folks. And as I was explaining earlier, if you didn't hear, generally what I ask that people do when they have a question is when we get to that part to put it in the chat. And that is also down on that bottom part of your window there. And you can just click chat and then make sure it says to, you could just send it to me. You could say to Alexis or to everyone and type your comment or your question. And I will try to get to as many of those, hopefully all of them, as possible. So with the logistics and the housekeeping out of the way, I will introduce Mary and Wilson. So Mary Keller is a historian of religions. Her first book, The Hammer and the Flute, won the Best First Book Award at the American Academy of Religions, and her current research interests include the Native Memory Project, which is at that website, the Native Memory Project, or nativememoryproject.org. She helped produce the short film Return to Four Tops Father, which can be viewed from Montana Public TV, and she teaches at the University of Wyoming. And then we also have Wilson Dickinson, and he is a scholar, writer, community organizer, and his work takes place at the intersection of philosophical theology, sustainability, social justice, and spiritual practice. And he teaches at Lexington Theological Seminary. So as you can see, I think credentials from both of you that will guide us well into this conversation. And so Wilson, I wanted to start with you, and I think kind of start basic, which for some of you all may be what you already know, but I think it'll be helpful for laying the groundwork for what we're going to talk about, and to just talk a little bit about what even is ecotheology and kind of how you see that maybe playing out a little bit now, and then feel free to take that in whatever direction speaks to you and your work.
Yeah, thank you, Alexis, and thank you for the invitation to be here, and thanks everybody for taking some time out in the evening to have a conversation. So ecotheology is kind of thinking that takes place at the intersection of ecology and theology. That's pretty much all I have to add, so we can. So I think that there's kind of a negative way of defining ecotheology and a positive way. And so kind of a negative way is that in response to the environmental crisis, ecotheology from the perspective of, the tradition that I come from the perspective of Christian theology, sees the ecological crisis as rooted in deeper crises that are spiritual in nature, but that are societal in nature, and that are also kind of economic and political in nature. And so ecotheology, and even in the history of environmentalism, especially in America, the kind of the formulation of eco-justice and the voice of progressive Christians has been pretty significant in underlining these kind of the justice issues that are related to issues of environment. And so negatively defined, ecotheology wants to say that Christian traditions have both this insight in how to frame and diagnose problems, but then also that there are all these resources from the tradition that can help us, can help Christians and Christian communities be a part of the widespread and wide-scale transformation that is needed. And so I guess in my academic work, right, I try to see the moral visions and spiritual exercises and communal practices of Christian theology and see how they can contribute to both of those tasks. And kind of just to put it kind of concretely, I'd like to tell the story of my sister, I guess about a year ago, was reading Gospel of Mark with her son. And, she came up to me and she said, bread keeps on coming up. What's the bread symbolize? And, no matter what age I am, I'm always going to be her little brother. And so I just kind of was like, I can handle this one. By bread, he means bread, right? So at the heart of the gospel, there really is a concern with materiality. There's a concern with bread, and that bread in the gospel is about hunger. It's about economic systems. Why are those people hungry? And those economic systems, especially in the early empire, it's obvious how much they're rooted in agricultural systems and the breakdown of ecological systems. And so ecotheology is about kind of unveiling a lot of that stuff. And that's kind of a negative definition of it in some ways, or starting from the place of a problem. You could also positively define it and say that ecotheology is about kind of following the positive creation incarnational visions and practices that are all over the place in Christian history and in Christian traditions, though there are all kinds of other counter practices and visions. And so there's all kinds of positive visions about how to live in this world otherwise and how to live in this world joyfully and sustainably. And so that bread from Mark is about hunger, but it's also about sustenance. It's about the blessings, the daily bread. It's about the blessings that come from a right relationship with the land. And it's also about community and kind of a joyful form of community. So ecotheology is about trying to look with that green lens to both kind of uncover some deeper roots of a problem, but then also to see the real resources that Christian traditions have for being a part of kind of the work of justice and transformation. And I guess also I'll say briefly, I'm talking too much. Sorry, I guess that's what I'm here. But
no, yeah.
So I'm both. So this is both part of my scholarly work, but then also I'm, as Alexis said, I'm a pastor and an organizer, and a lot of that work for me happens under the umbrella of this organization called the Green Good News, which does local work here in Kentucky, especially around issues of food justice and sustainability. So there's a dinner church that I run. There's a community garden that's a couple blocks from my house. It's a collaboration with some churches and a local college. And then also I work a lot with churches, seminary schools, and community organizations around issues of food justice and sustainable living. Yeah. So that's kind of my, I guess, take on ecotheology, though there's so much more to say.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful, I think, for framing it from, as you said, the positive and the negative, and thinking holistically about what Christian traditions and stories can contribute to it. And, thinking specifically too, and to kind of get into the connection, I think that is with Mary's work as well, like about this question as we're thinking now about this global pandemic. And one of the things I think that has arisen from that is just this reminding or uncovering of the interconnectedness of everything and everyone in so many ways. And so I'm wondering if you could just, I don't know, speak a little bit to that. And you'd also mentioned some of the agrarian ideas from Jesus' time and from the scriptures and their interdependence on each other in the land as well. So I'm wondering if, I don't know, there's maybe a thread there that connects kind of those ancient stories to us and what we're starting to remember, if you will, during this time. And yeah, through that eco lens, I guess.
Yeah, well, and so on the negative fronts, I see, a lot of ways in which kind of an environmental perspective, but also an eco-theological perspective helps us think about this moment. The environmentalist Mike Davis has written some pieces lately, and he's written pretty extensively on issues of pandemic, and kind of, he wrote a book 15 years ago that saw this coming.
Wow.
Not that it was unique to him. He was this scientific community knew this was coming in.
Yeah, yeah.
And what he uncovers is how this he calls this a medical Katrina, right? And
Mm,
so whereas there were kind of natural elements to Katrina, it's a crisis that's been put on steroids by climate change, and that is profoundly destructive because of the failure of all kinds of political and economic structures, right? So with this
mm-hmm.
pandemic, it's rooted in, at the very least, the destruction of all kinds of habitats, right? So
Yeah.
there's this kind of denser population of bats in smaller places, and so these these viruses spread more quickly. And then because of industrial agriculture and because of these wet markets in China, I mean, they haven't exactly traced it yet, but it's probably from those sources where you have this really kind of dense industrialized treatment of animals where these viruses just run haywire, and then they find there's whole new life because of all these densely populated cities where there is profound poverty and slums. And then things
Mm-hmm.
get spread around the world through global travel and also through market pressures where people can't stop or slow down. And then
Yep.
our economic structures have also created this situation where public health has been eviscerated over the last decade, wasn't even in the best place to begin with, and where kind of hospitals are organized around profit, not so much the common good.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you can you can see kind of those kind of deeper spiritual, societal, and economic roots. And one of the things that's been really transformative for me is to see that, like an analogy of that at work in the Gospels, where I kind of like to imagine thinking about Jesus, who's this he's this peasant from this little nowheresville, Nazareth. There's like 200 people there, and they're all farmers. And I think that he sees, so and I guess this gets us back into the indigenous, kind of the relationship with indigenous communities. Like, this is an agrarian community, and you look in the Hebrew scriptures and you see all kinds of wisdom that is about living in a place, and living in a place with, in covenant. And the
Mm-hmm.
covenant is always between God, neighbor, and land.
Mm-hmm.
And the laws are about relationships between people and relationships with the land, and kind of a sustainable life coming out of that. So I think young Jesus sees that, he's shaped by it, and then he also sees that the empire is changing the land and has been changing, and this is ongoing story in the Bible. Empire changes kind of the relationships and creates basically what I think is we understand as plantations, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
Jesus sees both in his hometown this sustainable way of life with its own problems,
Yeah.
but this sustainable way of life uh, next to these plantations. But the thing is that Jesus is not just a farmer; he's also a carpenter, right? And so right down the
Mm-hmm.
road is Zephyrus, and so young Jesus is walking through this kind of agrarian setting where he's also seeing all these plantations. He's seeing what it does to the people, and then he goes to Zephyrus as a carpenter, and he sees where all the wealth is going. He sees where it's being
Yeah.
funneled into all these new building activities for the empire, and he also sees the poor. And so when we read the Gospels, I didn't see this for a long time because it was allegorized, but
Mm-hmm.
all over the place in the Gospels, there are day laborers, right? There are desperate and dying poor. There are all kinds of elites who are associated with the empire who are made very nervous by Jesus, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
I think that there is a sense in which we can see both this critical part with Jesus, where he's unveiling the profound social, spiritual, and economic roots of these problems that we take as normal and natural sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think it's rooted in these Hebrew traditions, um, that that I'm guessing have a very deep resonance with. I mean, I'm not completely ignorant of indigenous traditions, but I'm I'm really afraid to even talk about the connections to that. So I'm deeply grateful that Mary is here.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Wilson, and we'll for sure delve more into that. But you just teed it up so nicely to go to Mary. So Mary, I'm going to pass it over to you and have you kind of address some of these connections that Wilson has raised, and even questions about the perceived connection and the relationship to the land and covenant and all those sorts of things. I'm interested. I think we're interested to hear your thoughts on that.
So thanks very much. And I want to say, first of all, that you may hear a ding when I am unmuted, because there is a spirit alive in my computer that sends me a notification of which I have no idea where it comes from. I have been unable to stop this little troublesome spirit. And while I'm being cheeky, I also want to suggest that this is going to speak to my notion of spirits afoot, in that our relationship to technology is often talking through us in ways that we don't control. And in this way, though I might be using Zoom in an online environment, it is all smarter than me, and I know it's using me. So that's my long-winded version of, if you hear a ding, I cannot stop it.
Okay.
I'm going to put it that way. And then secondly, I think I'll go ahead and pull up a little, it's like 4 slides.
Great.
And desktop and share. And
oh, great. Yeah.
We go to presentation. Let me go to, here we go. And now we go back. All right. So spirits afoot. So let me try to first take note of some of the really important things that Wilson said with regard to Bible as a resource for actually understanding a critical insight on what empire does, right? And that one of the things that is really important is to listen to the voices that have spoken from the outside of those power machines, because they understand how the power machines are chewing some people up. And in that same way, now here, 400 years some after this exciting thing called discovery and the subsequent development of imperial Europe throughout Africa and South Asia and the United States, Canada, North and South, a place that was called the New World, which always just bites in the back of my mouth, like biting your tongue, right? That some place that had been peopled gets called new, is one of those pieces that lets me know how my ancestors imagined land, right? And that's part of my heritage, that's part of my legacy. So with spirits afoot, I am attempting to, I'm a non-Indigenous person. I'm attempting to bring the insights of Indigenous experts and Indigenous scholars to the issue of in these times. And again, it's going to be one of those voices from the side that might help us see how a machine or a monster is at work. So the first thing I want to do in order to get there is to think about the 2 terms that I want to use here, persons and spirits. Now, let me just do a little bit of humor here. I've been studying spirit possession for 20 some years. I'm so comfortable and familiar moving across it. But what I do understand is that if I say spirits or spirit possession, it is really likely that people might have a spinning head in The Exorcist in mind. And I want to ask you to please give me a chance to think human and spirit differently, so that we don't have the poor child with her spinning head, and instead we have a sense of matter itself, the matter in grass, in trees, in water, in wind, as itself spirited matter. So if you'll hang with me, I promise we're not heading to spinning heads. So persons, from an indigenous perspective, is described by Alana Jefferson Tatum as morally efficacious beings, according to her study with Vudan members in Nigeria. And so Alana Jefferson Tatum is a name I'm putting up here because I think you all might want to pay attention to her work, that she's very good. So she's at Tufts, and she got a Master in Theological Studies from Harvard University. So like me, she works from both the comparative angle of being able to look at multiple traditions, but seriously considering the philosophical root of words like spirit and agency. Now, if you define, as the Vudan community she was studying with, if you define person as morally efficacious beings, then you end up with a continuum. It's not just that us human things are persons. Rather, while every human animal might be a human, to become a person is an achievement regarding your moral efficacy. And it means that non-human players in your community might also be morally efficacious beings. So that for this Vodun community, for instance, there is a plant that is understood to be the source of the earth. And that plant is a morally efficacious being. It would be one of the humans with which you had, it would be one of the persons with which you would have a moral obligation. So I hope we're kind of moving into a different kind of notion of person. If we look at the Haudenosaunee, who have been more largely known to us as the Iroquois Confederation, but the selected reading, and thank you also, Alexis, for making it available, from Basic Call to Consciousness. So when the Haudenosaunee call themselves real people, it is by this name that they signal the possibility of being a non-real person, right? That's the nature of signs. If you need a sign that says there's a real person, it means also that the opposite is a possibility. So they call themselves real people, but that means it's an achievement, and that being an unreal person is a possibility. Now, in our time of zombie apocalypses, you might wonder whether we as a culture are considering these unreal people ourselves. But that was just a leap. So a real person is one who, quote, supports life in conjunction with other beings. So we see a different but related idea from the Haudenosaunee of person as a morally efficacious being. So a person is someone who would support life in conjunction with other beings. If you take care of your horses, you are being a person. A spiritual guardian, this is still a quote from Basic Call to Consciousness, is a real person. So that notion of morally efficacious and of guardian, meaning that you have work that you are required to do to maintain an achievement as a person. So this is the kind of person I want us to think on a spectrum of. And now, let's go to spirits. So, and this was one of the quotes from the reading that you guys can access from that link. According to the Haudenosaunee, we believe that all living things are spiritual beings. Spirits can be expressed as energy forms manifested in matter. A blade of grass is an energy form manifested in matter, grass matter. I want to pick up on Wilson's notion that the bread was bread. Right? We're talking about matter and spirit in as one does not need to ascend from the body to find spirit, but that matter like grass, a substance like bread, is what we're really talking about. The spirit of the grass is that unseen force which produces the species of grass, and it is manifest to us in the form of real grass. So now, if one just takes a look around and thinks about tree spirit, rock spirit, concrete spirit, water spirit, this is a kind of spirit that I want us to think about a person being in a morally efficacious relationship with. And in a lot of the ways that our contemporary physics and ecology tell us that we are literally entangled, and they tell us that trees are talking to each other. This is one of the ways that I want to think about a spirited world. So, that spirits are energetic materiality. They are ambivalent, not dualistic. And this is important. This is often a departure from what is understood as a Christian theological framework, is that not good and evil, not Holy Spirit and Satan, not dualistic, but that spirits across these many indigenous cultures are generally ambivalent because they're powerful. You have got to respect this power. Their energy contains the power to heal, to harm, and to protect. And given the encounter with Western Christianity that happened in colonialism was so often violent and dehumanizing, then local spirit was really, really necessary to try to heal oneself, to potentially develop some way of harming someone who wants to harm you, and to protect yourself. So spirits in this case, and in thinking of an indigenous spirit, are understood to be local to the place. So since we are talking about pandemics and globalization, and this is at a scale that we know our poor brains can't hardly grasp, spirit is understood to be at work at a local scale. And so one of my favorite botanists, plant geneticists, Wes Jackson, speaks of the genius of the place, and that we need to start consulting the genius of the place in order to create a mosaic of proper living relationships. If you're in the desert, consult the genius of that place, and please don't try to have a swimming pool there. You know, just to put it in a cheeky way, but that genius comes from genie and spirit. So the idea that the land would have a spirit. So I want to say that local spirit has an indigenizing possibility. And by that, I mean the local spirit, if you are consulting the genius of the place, you have an opportunity to become more entangled with and a part of a place. So the spirit of the place connects you to the legacy of the land, the bodies buried in it, the power in its skies, the ecology and the economy of the place. And so just to wrap up here for right now, I use this example of an indigenous forefront in global efforts to do ecological guardianship, in that my sense about morally efficacious beings is that indigenous communities are often on the forefront, because that question of when to act and how to act is essential still in what has survived through this conquest experience. That a sense of moral efficacy and knowing when to stand, when to be a water guardian. And so how can I conclude this, I'm going to try to escape the big screen. And Wilson, maybe you would be better than I at trying to bring up that from an ecotheology to, and this is something I published in the fourth R, the idea of living in a world of worlds. I would say that I am somebody who desires to live in a world of worlds, and that part of the potential I see there is the capacity to become a person, a morally efficacious being, and that will be developed by consulting the genius of the place.
Thanks, Mary. Yeah, I'm gonna give you guys an opportunity to talk. Oh, go ahead.
There. No, I just had to stop.
Oh, yeah. To give you guys a little bit of an opportunity to, dialogue on each other's work. And then while we're doing that, folks, if you have questions or thoughts that you'd like addressed, I noticed a couple of you have already sent me a message, but if you have other thoughts that come up, go ahead and start putting them in the chat. And then as we take the next couple minutes for you, Wilson and Mary, to talk, then I'll start gathering questions. So yeah, I don't know, Wilson, if you have anything that you'd like to say to connect your work as well.
Yeah, well, yeah, there's so much to say. I feel like one of the things that really, the thing I've been most recently, or the project that most recently finished, was an environmental justice reading of the Gospels called The Green Good News. And one of the things that was really centered on was seeing the centrality of the covenant in the Gospels. And part of that was building on the work of some other people, like somebody like Ellen Davis, who wrote this book on agrarian reading. It's Scripture, Culture, and Agriculture, an agrarian reading of the Old Testament. And she says something that's not unique to her, but that really just the lights went on in my head when basically she's like, Israel, it's not just a nation state. In fact, for them, in terms of Hebrew Bible, it's a land, and it's mostly about the land, and it's mostly about a specific people being in relationship to the land. And that connection changed so many aspects of the Gospels and changed the kind of the praxis of the Christian movement that comes out of that, and even how I understand that today. And so there's so many resources in there. And so then there's also other connections there where I think what the Spirit, the Holy Spirit in the Gospels, I think is about kind of the power of communal connection, right? The way that God moves through communities when things are organized and animated by love and justice and joy through the ways of the covenant. I think that's what the power of the Holy Spirit is. It's more complicated than that, but I think that's kind of at the heart of it. So I think there is this kind of inspirited world that animates Jesus' imagination, or at least of the disciples. And also there is a strong sense in the Gospels, and this is an old line, that there are also, part of the late ancient imaginary, there's this sense that there are also these other powers that possess us in the world. And so to see Jesus' stories of demon possession as kind of taking off those old layers of thinking they're about this kind of supernatural issue, but instead seeing them in terms of this, so like, for example, one of the most, at least in Mark, the most complicated possession story is, the demon calls itself Legion, right? It is the colonial powers that are possessing, and Jesus's intervention is to be able to cast those powers out. So I think there's a resonance where there's all these really interesting place-based, spirit-driven connections that help me see not just that message in the Gospels, but that help me see strategies for moving forward now. Because I think that the way that Jesus works in the Gospels, at least as I understand it, is he doesn't have a blueprint. He has emergent practices that build communal power, right? And so there isn't like just this giant kind of, this piece goes here and this piece goes there, but there are these practices that build and feed and replicate, and they do all this stuff in the world, right? So they create the kingdom of God. So there's all these connections, but then there's also all these other stories, right, that are part of the Christian heritage. Where this one theologian from Duke, Willie James Jennings, wrote this book called The Christian Imagination, where he wants to talk about the role that Christianity played in colonialism. And that's a giant book and really complicated. but one of the things he wants to say is that at the heart of the colonial Christian imagination, it played a very intimate relationship with the construction of whiteness, right? And so whiteness is, European people were not calling themselves white from the beginning of time, right? Whiteness is a category that emerges in legal situations that is in contrast with black. And what does black mean in those situations? It means people who can be owned, right? And so whiteness, from this historical perspective, emerges in this colonial moment. That's where it comes from. That's just what its roots are. And what it is it plays this function where it disassociates and it displaces people, right? So it makes it to where people are no longer from a place and they're no longer from a particular people, right? So you're not my name is Wilson Dickinson. My name might as well be Waspy Wasperton, right? So my people are like basically from Britain and Germany. But I mean, the structures of whiteness make it to where I am not, an English American, right? My family happens to be very interested in its roots, so I have a sense of some of my ancestors, but that's also disassociated from a lot of my life. So anyway, so there are these ways in which Christianity has played a role in whiteness, which disassociates, right, which separates you from your ancestors, and which displaces, which separates you from a place that's part of this whole colonial project of making the world property. And I've probably gotten in way too much complication here, but Jennings, just to make one little point, Jennings says that Christian missionaries played a very important role in this because of the Christian imagination that saw itself as always exercising hospitality wherever it went, right? So Christian missionaries showed up on this land and they thought it was a new world, right? Or they showed up to a place that had a name with people with ancestors that had lived there for centuries, and they thought they were the hosts. They were like, oh, no. We have all this stuff to tell you about this place, right? So there's these complicated legacies of, all this like beautiful inheritance from Christian theological traditions that I think really gives us all these ways forward. And that's tied in with these other more, I guess, with these other difficult parts of our history, but that, we still have to learn from, because they ensnare us too.
Yeah.
Us, I mean, I guess me, the, white people,
privileged
settlers.
Yeah. So there's a lot of good thoughts and questions. I'm trying to kind of like group them into buckets, and think about which would connect to kind of what we've been, the thread that you're on, Wilson. So yeah, so there's been a handful, and you guys are obviously welcome to look at the chat too, Wilson and Mary, but I'm trying to streamline it a little bit for you. So questions around like this awareness of our location, whether that's like the privilege of whiteness or our physical location on the land, and like moving to that awareness and thinking about how we, Mary, I think, you talked a little bit about, or a lot about this, and the genius of the land, and like, because we become aware of that, like how we then move into protecting and healing. And I think that goes, trying not to ramble too much, but I think that goes a little bit with some questions too about just like the practicalities of like, what does this look like? How do we, once we become aware, like do the work of listening to the genius of the land? What does that look like? How do we decolonize? So that's like a big grouping of questions that I'm trying to encapsulate in one. So I'm just going to put that out there and let you guys comment on it.
And I want to pick up on the question about indigenizing. I heard the word indigenization. This was from Russell Smith.
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Can I be indigenized by the spirit of the place? Now, this is where I want to look at the kind of politics of me talking about spirits and a local genius that could indigenize, because one of the things I have been really wrestling with lately is that there is a doubleness to the word indigenous that has to do with kind of an anthropological reality right now. So when Basic Call to Consciousness was published in the 70s, that was the first time that the name indigenous peoples was used by a group of people who called themselves indigenous peoples, and they were seeking a seat at the table at the United Nations because their seats at the table in nations were not happening. The work wasn't getting done. They went for a bigger lever of power and kind of unite under the umbrella term indigenous peoples, which means that the term with a capital I is a term of ancestry and lineage. I will never become an indigenous person in that way. It doesn't matter how many languages or traditions I study or anything like that. I'll never become capital I indigenous. It's a kind of modern term that reflects the reality of those who underwent the thing called civilizing. But we are all human animals who have related origins, and those origins have to do with our cleverness in moving out nomadically and establishing homes, sometimes doing that violently and sometimes doing that rather in novel ways. And so the little I indigenous is something I would claim for myself, that, or at least I attempt to achieve. That's my goal for a life well lived, would be that I have consulted with the genius of the place enough that I can be, in this globalized sense of us all being earthlings, that I can be an earthling. I can be indigenous to the planet. But the capital I indigenous, I absolutely respect and articulate that space as the ancestral lineages. But that's not to try to claim, and there's something super spiritual about those people, and they're so cool, and they always lived so nicely, you know. It's not to essentialize indigenous people. It's not a litmus test. It's not a DNA test. It was a 1970s term. So with that kind of politics of the term in place, then I would say, this is part of the paradox of living in our time, is that there are both capital I indigenous people and that all of us earthlings are in this together, and that it's important, my alliance in identifying that is important because those who live closest to the land, who are poorest, who have suffered the greatest dislocation, those are the ones who will be impacted hardest by climate change. So this is about an alliance of responsibility, because my people have Wetiko, is from the book Columbus and Other Cannibals. Wetiko was the name an indigenous scholar gave, an American Indian scholar gave, to our cannibal psychosis. Like, we will eat up everything, we will eat up each other. So I come from a people with cannibal psychosis, and I'm attempting to consult the genius of the place. Now, that doesn't yet describe the connection to spirit possession, and I can wait and not do that, or I could do that now.
Why don't we, let's see, there's a lot of questions, so I want to make sure we get to some of the genres of them at least. So let's maybe do one more, and then we can, if it makes sense, come back to that. But yeah, I think you have both hit on this, just the idea of the colonialism that exists within the stories of the, you know, the ancient Christians, the ancient, or you know, whatever, the early Christ communities, I guess, and later, and even the early Hebrew. There was a comment about this, you know, early Hebrew folks that went in and conquered, or as the stories go, you know, God is giving them these lands that are already occupied. And just so having that, I think for those of us that subscribe to some sort of Christianish tradition, you know, having those in the back of our minds, and then thinking about how our faith informs our decolonial actions and our desire to indigenize ourselves in the genius of the land. I don't know how to, I guess, phrase that into a question, except for just thinking about like, what are some ways that we do that. I think, Mary, you spoke very eloquently about your own desire and practice, and maybe Wilson, you can talk a little bit too about your work with the Green Good News and the stuff that you mentioned about the gardens, you know, even just like simple things like that. I think, you know, in helping folks think through like, what does this look like for me on the ground as I'm waking up to sort of these consciousness ideas. Yeah, I'm always interested to hear some of like the here and now practicalities, if you have any.
Well, one of the deep connections with the land in the Hebrew scriptures is about the Sabbath laws. And I know that we're all feeling this crisis in very different ways, right? I'm the father of a 5-year-old, and so I'm guessing the rhythms of my days, you know, with having my son around all the time and doing work from home is very different from other people. But and I know that this crisis is stressful for everybody, and it's taking up a lot of space. But I think that there is also a way in which we're getting to experience different rhythms. And I think maybe one of the ways, because one of my kind of interests both in my life and in my future writing is thinking about suburban placemaking, right? So what does it mean to make place in places that have forsaken the idea of place, right? That have kind of basically paved over everything and tried to make it look uniform, but that also actually have green spaces and spaces where community could be created, even though the rhythms of that life make it so difficult. Well, we're in a time right now where it is hard to physically be with other people, though I think that has opened up some spaces where we are experiencing a different rhythm of life, and this is going on for long enough to where I think we're getting some perspective on that. And I've been talking to friends through Zoom, and some of them have been, you know, I get this group of leaders from the Christian food movement together once a month, and we were sharing stories about how many more animals we're noticing, how much we're noticing the vegetation in our area, and how some animals are just coming down and out, right? So places where, I saw like some video like in Wales, like, you know, the goats are coming down from the hills. And so I think there is an opportunity right now to experience a different rhythm of life, and that when this crisis is over, you know, it's going to be hard to keep some of that wisdom. I think that there's something in there that could really to be transformative, because so if we're kind of getting, you know, toward the end of the climate change talk, I think the worst thing that happens in climate change talks is that end where you try to give people like, here's the glimmer of hope, you can go do these 5, you can go make these 5 choices. And I think that is actually led to a good deal of cynicism and despair, because one, it feeds into this idea that we're all sovereign individuals that can do everything on our own. And this is a systemic problem, and we're not going to solve it individually. And guess what? You are not individually responsible. And the more you feel like you're individually responsible, the more inactive you're going to be. So I think instead of like, I think it's based, I don't think that we really even need to focus on our consumer choices that much. I think they're important. I spend a lot of time sweating about them. But I think focusing on consumer choice is like wanting to conserve water and say, okay, when you go up to the fire hose, it's always on, try to take a sip. Try to just sip. No, the problem is that the fire hose is always on, and that's why we can't conserve water.
Right.
So what we need is is communal action. And so what we need are, so instead of like making a different consumer choice, I think what we need to do is something like planting a tree. Maybe literally, but probably more figuratively. Right, a tree is a simple thing that has growth built into it, that has life built into it, and it just grows on its own, right? And so we need to find these things in our lives that are relational, like trees are, and that are replicable and that are joyful. And to from that place, let change grow. And actually, I think that's how Christ works in the Gospels.
Yeah. Thanks, Wilson. I too have a 5-year-old running around in a New York City apartment, so I have solidarity with you in this new ecosystem that we are creating. So yeah, Mary, I will head back to you as we come in on our last few minutes here and let you go back to your connection between spirit possession, if you want.
Okay, and I do see that somebody has asked, what's the name of the book? Basic Call to Consciousness. And if you look up in the chat, and if anybody is wondering about how you get to the chat, just move your cursor over the bottom of the Zoom window and that'll make it appear. But if you connect to Alexis's first post in the chat, it'll actually bring you to a web page where you can read part of a chapter of that. So the thing about if one understands matter to have a spirited kind of energy and a sense of local spirits as one of those ways to be in relationship to the genius of the place that you're in, I think a little bit about James Cone's Black Theology of Liberation, where he says that a people who does not recognize itself does not care about itself. And thus, if I grow to know the genius of the place here in a town that is absurdly called Cody, Wyoming, right? The guy who got called Buffalo Bill instead of he killed all the Buffalo Bill, right? He gets to make it sound like good guy, Buffalo Bill, right? So I come with all this settler identification that does not recognize itself in the fact that it actually removed people from here. So that to come to be aware of the genius of this place is to become aware of the indigenous stories about the place, I would say. And that this question, Wilson was just tapping on that question of how much agency do any of us consumers have in trying to drink from the hose. That question of agency, one of the things we find in an indigenous notion of person is that it is not about a self, and it is always about a self's responsibility to relationships. Now, what I think one way of understanding climate change is that this is the first ever global spirit, and it is categorically different than the local spirits, and that this spirit is categorically different because humans made it. I cannot make that piece of grass. I can't make grass spirit. I could plant it, but there is something beyond me that is part of grass spirit. But give me a car, baby, and I will drive. Give me an airplane, I will fly. Give me a computer, I will plug the thing in, and I will tell myself why we can't yet afford a solar panel. So the thing that we made by trying to domesticate the energy that is concentrated, like talk about a spirit, a lump of coal has a hell of a spirit in it. A tree has a hell of a, these guys are carbon concentrations. It's why we so cleverly try to release their energy. And what we have done is we have set loose a spirit that is afoot, and it is the local and the indigenous is where I see the guardians attempting a technology appropriate to living with the global spirit. There, but I did just tell you guys that you are all possessed by the spirit of climate change. So if anyone would like to have a fight about that, or a conversation, I'd also like that.
Yes, Puts spirits afoot in a new context, I suppose. Okay, so we're coming up on the last few minutes. I definitely this time did not get to every specific question. I really tried to kind of, like I said, like group them into sort of batches of questions. So if either of you have closing thoughts, or if you've seen something in the chat that you specifically want to address, I just want to give you guys a few minutes to do that now before we end.
How do I send a message to Mary?
In the chat, there's a thing at the bottom, and there's like a blue box right there that's highlighted, and it will often say everyone. You can click the little arrow and it'll drop down everybody's name, and you can just type in Mary and you'll get
I typed in Mary and I got privately is in red.
Yes. Yep.
Has she got it? The question.
I don't know, but I'm gonna actually like ask us to concentrate on wrapping up, and if you have an additional question, I can help you facilitate that. Okay. So Wilson or Mary, if you have any closing thoughts, or if you have additional questions that you want to address.
Okay. Can I make a plug?
Yeah, please.
All right, I'm going to put it in the. Oh, it kind of came up. So I work at Lexington Theological Seminary, and if this attached or connected to this conversation, we're doing a webinar on Earth Day. It's the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. If you're able to, it's one of the things, one of the links I put over in the chat. We're doing a webinar where one of our theologians, Emily Askew, is going to talk about dealing with despair in the face of climate change. I'm going to talk about finding your place in social change, and then one of our professors of homiletics is going to do a presentation on preaching the lectionary texts coming up. So that's just a plug if people are interested. Also, I plug my book in there, Green Good News.
Yay, good. And I will also.
I'm sorry.
No, that's perfect. I'm glad you did that. You're always welcome when you come on these things, or at any time, to do that. And when I send the follow-up email for the replay and everything, I like to include all the links and the resources and everything that we talked about. So I'll be sure to put that in there as well for folks. Mary, did you have any closing remarks?
Yeah, that if, and I think I can actually discuss Ernest's question as well about, so what's the spirit of concrete? That if you have a look at the article, one of my suggested articles on indigenous science and then fiction, that's an indigenous scholar having a look at and recommending to one that you need to consult with your ancestors regarding the kinds of futures and pasts of your community, such that I would say absolutely concrete spirit is part of the past and the future that my community is leaving on the land. And that concrete, because it has such a huge energy component to it, it is just, it is part of Waitiko. It is part of cannibal psychosis, because it takes so much energy and it causes a lot of ecological harm. So yes, I would say concrete has a kind of spirit, and me and my people need to think seriously what it means that it's part of our legacy.
Thanks, Mary. And there's been comments too, I just want to say, from others of our own or Westar, not our own scholars, but who are also affiliated with Westar. Mila has weighed in, and Ellie Elliott has weighed in, and they're also kind of adjacent to some of these conversations in their work. And I think there's a lot more to be said here. So folks that are tuning in, yeah, feel free to also let us know what types of topics you'd like to hear more on, and we could certainly continue in this vein with these folks and with others. And I'm always looking for ideas for topics to do these roundtables and Q&As on. So I just wanted to call them out as well for their contributions. So thanks everybody. We are right at 9 o'clock. So yes, thank you so much. And I will put this, I will put the link to Westar membership in the chat, which I always do at the end, and invite you, if you are not already a member and participant in Westar, to check us out. And help us continue to bring this sort of scholarship virtually now, but once we're back to whatever the new normal is, then we do lots of in-person events around the country and conferences and all sorts of things. So, and we only can do that because of our lovely supporters, and we would love to have you as one of them. So thank you, Wilson. Thank you, Mary. I will follow up tomorrow in an email with the replay and also the additional resources that you guys have provided. And yeah, be well, everybody. Stay well. Have a good night, and we will check in May, if not before. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alexis.
Yeah, take care, everyone. See ya.